Hello everyone and welcome to another vlog. Today I'm going to talk about long exposure photography. I'm going to outline a short guide for you to understand what is long exposure photography, why would you even think about doing long exposure photos, the accessories and what else do you need to do long exposures, and the actual guide, how do you actually go and do a long exposure. My name is Toma, Phototom here on YouTube. I'm a full-time landscape and travel photographer. So if you're interested in this kind of topics, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel for more similar videos. So let's start with a definition or an explanation of what a long exposure is. Usually when you do your photos, you click and the shutter speed is really fast. Now, there is no point that you could say, well, now there is a long exposure and now there is not a long exposure. But usually when you're talking about a second exposure or 2-second exposures, or when you go beyond this and you do 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 5, 10 minutes exposures, that is a long exposure. So the thing that you do is to capture in one shot multiple moments that happen through time. And the result is usually a very interesting one. And now we're getting to the second point. And now why would you even think about doing long exposures? Well, I'm doing long exposures for two reasons. The first reason is sometimes I'm in front of a landscape and at a point in time, usually during the day, when if I take a simple photo when the shutter is quick and just takes a snapshot of a slice of time, that photo would not be that interesting. I was in Norway and I'm visiting the beaches and the fjords during the day to know where to go and photograph for the sunrise and sunsets. But during the day, if you photograph the sea, it's not that interesting. So I thought to myself, why not using a long exposure technique to capture the landscape in a much more interesting way. Now let's talk about the accessories that you need. First of all, you need the tripod. You need the place to put your camera, and the tripod has to be sturdy. Long exposures involving capturing something that it's moving. Usually when that happens, you're either capturing the movement of the clouds because it's windy, or the movement of the water because it's flowing rapidly. In both cases, you need a sturdy tripod. So for the duration of the long exposure, your camera doesn't get vibrations. Another thing that you do is a remote control, because you will mostly be in bulb mode. Sometimes you can get away with a 30-second exposure, but usually you're doing much longer than that. So you will need a remote control, because in bulb mode you need a remote control to start the trigger and then stop the exposure at a certain moment. After that, you will need a ND filter. And I recommend a square format ND filter. Why? Because if you have a circular one and you mount that on top of your lens, every time you need to recompose, you will need to unscrew it. More than that, if you also use a polarizer, the first filter is the polarizer, and then if you screw it on top of that, it's very difficult to polarize, it's very difficult to unscrew. Sometimes they kind of get stuck one to each other and can be really painful to do this. So I would recommend a square format ND filter. I'm using the 10-stop ND filter from Lee. I also had the 6 stops that I broke during a workshop. It just went click, and because it's glass, it's very sensitive and shattered to pieces. Now let's talk about the most important aspect, and that is how do you actually go and do a long exposure photo. Now the first thing that you should do is take the photo without the ND filter. You should plan the exposure, you should plan the composition, plan what other filters you want to use, the polarizer and then the gradiated ND filter if you need one. Now I'm recommending you use an ND gradiated filter, and I'll tell you why. When you're using an ND filter, the brighter areas tend to get much brighter, and the darker areas tend to get much darker than in the case of a normal exposure. It's the way the light affects the sensor, but this is exactly what is happening. The long exposure photo that results is going to have a higher contrast than the normal photo. It depends on the brightness of the light, how big that contrast is. But that is why I'm recommending, if you think you need an ND gradiated filter, just use it. So the first thing that you do the exposure without the ND filter, and you think about everything that you have to think about. As I told you, exposure, subject, composition, and all that. And then you take a look at the settings that you have for that exposure. And once you are satisfied with those settings, you can use an app. I'm using Exposure Calculator, and you introduce those settings in the app. And the app will let you select an ND filter and then will give you a resulted time. Now, why I love this app, it's because if the resulted time, let's say it's far too long, for example, sometimes I have 10 minutes or 20 minutes, then I can tweak a little bit. What if I drop down the aperture a little bit? I don't want f11. Let's go with f8 and let's see the exposure time. Let's increase the ISO from 100 to 160 or to 320. Let's see what else we can do to get an exposure time that maybe it's not 20 minutes, it's 5 minutes. And sometimes you need something like this, especially if you're doing long exposures in the sunset and you don't have a 6-stop ND filter, as I only have the 10-stop, and in that case you may want to tweak these things. And after that, you switch your lens to, you do the focusing, you switch your lens to manual focus, and you also turn off the image stabilization technology that is built in your lens or your camera body, VR, IS, whatever it's called. You switch that off, because on some cameras, leaving that on will result on a shaky image. It will not be sharp, it will be like a moved image. And then you press the shutter using the remote in bulb mode, and you stop the exposure again with the remote after the time passes. Now, there are some cameras, for me as a Canon user, I always see the time frame or the time passed during the exposure, and I know exactly when to stop. I also have the opportunity or the ability to set a custom exposure time when I'm in bulb mode, so I really don't need a remote control. So if you have that feature, you don't need that. But if you don't see the time, or if you can't set an exposure time in bulb mode, then you will need something on your phone to measure the exposure time, and it's very simple to do this with your phone. Now, I really hope that you found this video useful. It's a short guide, but I believe it's everything you need to do a long exposure. You don't need anything else. You just go there now and do long exposures, and leave me a comment below if this is exactly what you needed to hear in order to understand what a long exposure is and what is the short thinking process of creating one. Now, thanks for watching, and until next time, bye bye.